thank you everyone for coming back on promptly. Welcome back, and for the last session this morning, we have Margrette Gress on how standpoint can matter in physics.
Thank you very much. Let me start my timer here. So if you're sold on the idea that standpoint matters in science, why wouldn't it matter in philosophy of science? Why wouldn't it play a role in metaphysical debates, in interpreting physical theories, in determining the bounds of physical possibility? In this talk, I'm going to explore three primary pathways for standpoint to matter in philosophy of physics. The first path shows how standpoint can matter if philosophy of physics is done as it usually is, what Lara Rucci calls the method of pristine interpretation. The second and third paths illustrate how standpoint can matter if Rucci is correct that pristine interpretation must be replaced by a more pragmatic, context-sensitive method of unpristine interpretation. But first, some table setting is needed. In her 2011 book, Interpreting Quantum Theories, Lara Rucci introduces a distinction between types of interpretation: pristine interpretation and unpristine interpretation. According to Rucci, pristine interpretation is the default traditionalist approach common in contemporary analytic philosophy of physics. Given this is a conference on pragmatism, I'm going to guess it's not too common in this crowd. The pristine interpreter focuses solely on nomological data. This is the laws and their symmetries, along with general metaphysical principles to determine which worlds are physically possible according to the theory, if we loosely identify the semantic content of the theory with the set of possible worlds in which its laws are true. Determining the bounds of physical possibility is closely tied with filling out the theory's content. Pristine interpretations of a theory are generalist. They are applicable across theories of the same type and across a theory's full range of applications. As a result, pristine interpretation is largely context-independent. The pristine interpreter does not concern themselves with how the theory is used. They also tend to be unimodal, meaning a pristine interpretation has a single, unified notion of physical possibility. The unpristine interpreter supplements nomological data with context-dependent extra-nomological data. This might include judgments about physically reasonable initial or boundary conditions, pragmatic modeling assumptions made in the context of particular experimental, explanatory, or interventionist applications, as well as other value-laden judgments. Unpristine interpretations tend to be particularist. They usually only apply to a single theory in certain contexts of application. Unpristine interpretation requires attention to the messy details of how theories are actually used, and may generate application-dependent judgments about physical possibility, what Rucci calls a kaleidoscopic notion of modality, or polymodal on these slides. There typically is no single unified notion of physical possibility within an unpristine interpretation of a theory. In her book, Rucci limits her discussion of pristine and unpristine interpretation to their applications in quantum systems with infinitely many degrees of freedom. In another paper I'm working on with Noel Swanson, we argue that unpristine interpretation is present in classical mechanics. Moreover, we argue that it is prevalent throughout all branches of physics. As such, I will be talking about pristine and unpristine interpretation as they apply throughout physics. Last bit of exegesis before we get into the weeds. I want to make it clear here that when I say standpoint, I do not mean the more narrow definition of feminist standpoint. Rather, the definition I use here is more broad and refers to the totality of one's prior experiences and how those experiences have shaped their perspectives, judgments, abilities, values, and technical skill. In two of the pathways I will discuss, I call upon Mark Wilson's physics avoidance. Physics avoidance captures the variety of ways we may idealize, approximate, abstract, or distort while doing physics. As a rule, we almost never model a physical system in full, gory detail. And this is not just because it's astronomically hard to keep track of everything, although this is an important limitation. Whether we're predicting, classifying, explaining, or intervening, some information about the system is more important, or some less important. On Wilson's telling, physics and science more generally are filled with sophisticated strategies for identifying and efficiently packaging this relevant information. Now we can get into the weeds. In Talks and Conversation, Rucci has suggested that if pristine is viable, it produces a no-go result for standpoint's influence in interpretive debates. However, I think there's still a way for standpoint to matter in pristine interpretation. The first path shows us this. Assuming that we all agree that standpoint can play an integral role in science, it is not far off to assume that it would play a role in a priori armchair reasoning. Many metaphysical debates depend on intuitions about thought experiments. Prima facie, it's plausible that standpoint will affect how different philosophers will react to different thought experiments. For example, Kantians and utilitarians have different intuitions about Baroque trolley problem cases. Experimental philosophy is partially motivated by the idea that standpoint can affect intuitions and about thought experiments. But beyond the scope of basic intuitions, many metaphysical debates turn on how we weigh different theoretical virtues of competing metaphysical systems, or on more local applications of inference to best explanation. In other work, Rucci makes a similar point. Advocates of Everettian, Bohmian, and collapse interpretations of QM often weigh the theoretical virtues of their preferred interpretation differently. Everettians often prize consistency with relativity, whereas Bohmians prioritize primitive ontology, etc. So how one goes about analyzing the premises of an argument or virtues of theoretical frameworks, whether or not they're inclined to agree with one side or the other, or even if they're familiar with a given metaphysical debate, is all standpoint dependent. The same principle applies to every interpreter of physical theories, pristine or unpristine. The second path shows one way that standpoint can influence unpristine interpretation. Unpristine interpretation has a much larger set of evidence to consider, and therefore more ways for standpoint to matter. It's not just the amount of data, but the kind of data. Recall that unpristine interpreters utilize nomological data and extra-nomological data. This includes, but is not limited to, initial and boundary conditions, pragmatic considerations, value judgments, idealization, approximation, abstraction, distortion, so on. This kind of data is highly contextual, and our ability to sift through the details to recognize relevant evidence and weigh it against other evidence is very likely shaped by standpoint. I think the best way to illustrate this is with an example inspired by Mark Wilson's 2013 paper, What is Classical Mechanics Anyway? Wilson argues that classical mechanics has no set of foundational axioms. Rather, point mass mechanics, rigid body mechanics, and continuum mechanics are all overlapping patches in a theory facade, none of which can be plausibly viewed as fundamental. Each theory patch has its own strategies of physics avoidance, different ways of identifying relevant parameters and sweeping irrelevant parameters under the rug, associated with different idealizations, abstractions, approximations, and distortions. If Wilson is right, unpristine interpretation should be everywhere in classical mechanics. Take, for example, any macroscopic object like a table. We can choose to model it as a swarm of point masses, a rigid body, or a table blob. Insofar as each patch has its own ways of doing physics avoidance, they also employ different conceptual architecture. Just as the unpristine interpreter says that you have a parochial set of observables or quantities, something much more extreme extends into Wilson's ideas. The conceptual ideas underlying much of the patches in the theory facade are local to the patch. For example, there are distinct notions of forces at play in point mass versus rigid body and continuum mechanics. With point mass, you have your Newtonian forces. In rigid body, you have your Newtonian plus constraint forces. And importantly, these violate Newton's third law. In continuum mechanics, you have generally Newtonian internal forces and your traction forces. So continuum mechanics requires balance equations relating body and traction forces, and this sort of thing isn't even present in the other patches. So due to this differing parochial conceptual architecture, we have to do different sorts of mathematical surgery to bring concepts into alignment. Stealing from my prior work with Noel Swanson, Wilson doesn't provide a great term for this process of bringing things into descriptive harmony, so we have termed it unpristine battlefield surgery, because why not? Taking notes from unpristine interpretation, if Rucci is right, this process of conceptual surgery is patently unpristine. It's going to be something that takes place on the battlefield. It's dependent on various sorts of twists and turns. To sum all this up, the strategies for physics avoidance one may be inclined to apply, what conceptual architectures they're familiar with, how they bring those conceptual architectures into alignment, are all influenced by the interpreter's standpoint. For example, see debates about contact interactions like Smith 2007 and Lang 2002, both seek to answer the same question: how are contact interactions between impenetrable bodies possible? Lang analyzes the problem in pristine fashion, drawing on tools from Newtonian point mass mechanics and metaphysical principles linking causation and locality. In contrast, Smith approaches the problem in more unpristine fashion, using tools from continuum mechanics. They ultimately arrive at different answers. Lang concludes that we must posit fields to rescue the idea of local contact interactions, whereas Smith concludes that contact interactions can be analyzed in terms of traction forces on the partially overlapping boundaries of two continuous bodies. Note that these traction forces are entirely absent in the point mass picture that Lang is working with. The ways in which Lang and Smith frame the problem, the space of available solutions, and the arguments they give are all shaped by differing physics avoidance strategies and preferred conceptual architectures. So pathway 2 concerns how standpoint influences unpristine interpretation of extra nomological data. What about nomological data? The unpristine interpreter approaches laws, symmetries, and metaphysical debates differently than the pristine interpreter. Focusing on symmetries, many philosophers are interested in determining which symmetries of the laws are joint carving, i.e., which symmetries relate physically equivalent descriptions of the system. Some philosophers, like North 2009, have proposed generalist, pristine recipes for identifying joint carving symmetries. In classical Hamiltonian mechanics, North argues that in any model, all symplectomorphisms are joint carving symmetries. In classical Lagrangian mechanics, joint carving symmetries are identified with contact transformations. She goes on to argue that since the latter are a proper subset of the former, Hamiltonian mechanics posits less physical structure and is therefore to be preferred on Occamist grounds. Both Swanson and Halvorson, 2012, as well as Bellet, 2013, argue that generalist, pristine recipes like this are inadequate. We need to carefully examine how Hamiltonian and Lagrangian mechanics are used to model particular classical systems. Once we do this, we find that in many cases, not all symplectomorphisms are joint carving, nor are all joint carving symmetries contact transformations. For example, in models of gravitational two-body systems, the Runge-Lenz vector is the conserved quantity associated with a symplectomorphism that maps orbits with different spatiotemporal geometry onto one another. The orbits all have the same energy, but different eccentricity. Plausibly, such geometrical differences represent real physical differences between symmetry-linked solutions. The symmetry in question is not joint carving, but we only recognize this by focusing on how the Hamiltonian gets applied in particular cases, not from the general features of the Hamiltonian framework. Bellet 2013 is rife with similar examples of how symmetry debates require unpristine interpretation. A quick note, neither Bellet or Swanson and Halvorson use the terms pristine and unpristine, but the distinction maps onto their arguments quite well, and at least one of them, Swanson, concurs. So where does standpoint come in? The process of determining which symmetries are joint carving requires using one's physical intuition in particular contexts of application, which is arguably standpoint dependent. Insofar as determining symmetries requires unpristine interpretation, standpoint influences nomological data and how it is considered. To further articulate how exactly this works, I'm going to summon more Ruchi. I'm sorry, Laura. In prior work, Ruchi proposes that knowers with epistemologically privileged backgrounds cultivate a kind of skill set that she likens to Aristotle's virtuous second natures. Ruchi's second natures are a kind of epistemological virtue built on an individual's prior experiences, as well as contingent facts about their background, like their race or gender. Borrowing from Aristotle, Ruchi uses virtue to characterize second natures as an acquired capacity, something for which no straightforward rules exist to learn from. Rather, it is a practice and focused learning that one comes to acquire second natures, a kind of techne instead of episteme. This resembles the acquisition and development of an individual's physical intuitions. As opposed to learning from a general rule book to follow for all of physics, physical intuitions are constructed from practice and dependent on the kinds of training one receives, for example, doing practice problems or working in a lab. They are an acquired capacity that can guide a physicist or philosopher of physics through, say, the process of interpreting a theory. I think it is extremely plausible that one's second natures factor into what sorts of physics avoidance strategies they employ, how they conduct their unpristine battlefield surgery, how they approach determining symmetries, and any other aspect of the interpretation process where one's years of practice may come into play. I still think that there are more ways for standpoint to matter in philosophy of physics. Ruchi's arguments in favor of unpristine interpretation are primarily epistemological, but if certain metaphysical views about laws of nature are correct, then unpristine interpretation appears inevitable. In particular, a Cartwrightian view, according to which laws are not exceptionless universal regularities, but rather ceteris paribus generalizations about causal powers, would make unpristine interpretation the only game in town. Beyond this, Cartwright's dappled picture of science suggests other possible pathways for standpoint to matter, but this requires further investigation. Another way that standpoint could matter, which I'm currently exploring, draws on Longino's contextual empiricism. According to Longino, objectivity in science depends not only on empiricism, but on the process of transformative criticism. It is this process that allows us to analyze, critique, and revise paradigm-framing background assumptions that guide normal science. The possibility of transformative criticism relies on having a community of knowers with diverse standpoints, organized in the right way. If Longino is correct about the grounds of objectivity in science, it is very likely that objectivity in the philosophy of science has a similar grounding. This suggests yet more pathways for standpoint to matter. So there's more investigative work to be done to further illuminate the ways in which standpoint matters in philosophy of physics. That being said, I hope I have begun to convince at least some of you, I know how philosophers work, that standpoint can matter in philosophy of physics. Thank you.
And we've got about 12 minutes for questions. Charles first.
That was awesome and troubling in the best way. So you talk about standpoint, you cash that out in terms of like beliefs and background and development. I work on how those things are fuzzy. So mental kinds, like folk psychological kinds, those things are socially affected and contingent, and so we don't actually have like this really pristine understanding of the human mind. And the reason your talk is troubling was because I was under the impression, stupidly, that if you just bypass all of that stuff and then go to evolutionary theory and go to ecology and biology, then we're going to get at some really solid stuff. And I knew, yeah, like our understanding of that stuff is fuzzy, but I don't know, I harbored this little nugget inside my heart that at least physics is pretty solid, right? Like, at least like we can use physics to constrain our biology, even if we don't have a nice story to tell about how levels connect, whatever. It has to at least be consistent. But now, everything is fuzzy in this kind of iterative, total circular way, which I think is as much an issue for you as it is for me. So if you want to cash out this notion of standpoint, I'd be curious to know how you're going to do that if the things that you are appealing to, like folk psychological kinds or any, like however you cash that out, if those things are themselves fuzzy, what does that mean for your account? Because for me, now I'm wondering what it means for mine.
Right. So if I'm understanding your question here, you have kind of an anti-realist worry about if we can know things independent of our mind?
No, I deny there's an epistemic gap altogether. My issue is more when you're cashing out what you mean by standpoint,
Mm-hmm.
you're appealing to concepts that I think are themselves questionable. So I'm
Okay.
wondering how you would handle that.
You know, I don't think I know enough about mental kinds and the work that you're referring to for me to articulate it on the spot right now.
Yeah.
But I think we should talk about it
Yeah.
during lunch and
Okay.
yeah.
Good. Chris, next?
Yeah, thanks. There's so much interesting stuff in a short talk. So let me pick up on one thing, which is just I'd be curious how to tie in this last point about like Longino with one of the cases you mentioned, right? So imagine we take the Smith versus Lang account of contact interactions. And so I'd be curious how do you take the next step? So once you acknowledge or once you characterize that as them having different standpoints, because Smith is using sort of the framework of continuum mechanics and Lang is using point particle Newtonian mechanics, how then does the use of those different standpoints lead to a better objectivity and understanding contact interactions?
Yeah. I mean, well, like I said in the talk, I'm currently in the process of writing this paper. I'm hoping for it to be my writing sample for graduate school applications. So I haven't done thorough digging in the same way that I have with the rest of the talk, with the Longino stuff yet.
Ah, okay.
So I'm not quite sure how the Longino will come into metaphysical debates like that in terms of like objectivity. But I do think that it's a fascinating avenue to explore, and I'm also interested in how to answer that question. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Kabir, next.
I mean, on the question of, or the point of avenues to explore, I mean, here's one that, I don't know if, what you think about it, it's like somewhat like perspectivalism or like Mittila Massimi's perspectival realism, which has the kind of same character in the sense of looking at different standpoints, but still holding on to maybe because of like responding to some of the worries raised by the first question. You don't have to go like Longino in some sense, but I don't know if you have encountered that before or what you think about. Okay, then maybe I should say a bit more about the Massimi perspectival realism stuff, about like having different perspectives and trying to create a sense of pragmatic reality out of those. And I would imagine that's a nice avenue to explore as well, that I like personally, but your mileage may vary.
Yeah, great. Yeah.
In the back, I'm sorry, let you in there. You have to press real hard.
Hello?
There we go.
Hey, there you go. Sorry, that was way too close. Thank you so much for the talk. That was really, really cool. I just wanted to invite you to say a little bit more about maybe this kind of where to go from here stuff. So I'm interested in some other questions about standpoint in social sciences and in history, and a little bit in philosophy as well. And sort of one of the things there that seems really interesting is that we still get these divergences when the training is so similar. It seems like when you go to university, you read a standard set of texts, you study a standard set of parts of the past, or you train in a standard set of methodologies. And yet then we argue for years about stuff, quite radically, right? And so one of the solutions that popped up in other areas is to say like, oh, well, we shouldn't be, because we want this diversity, we want to kind of go from this like really heterogeneous set of researchers, and we want to see, well, what do they agree on? And then we get this kind of, we're onto something solid, which I take it is sort of roughly where Longino is going. So is that where you see this pushing towards physics, that we should really be diversifying, and in philosophy too maybe, diversifying the kind of training we get to kind of maximize this heterogeneity, to maximize the kind of various standpoint positions, or is the view?
No, yeah, that's exactly it. Yeah.
Oh, awesome. Cool.
Yeah.
That's really cool.
So I agree with you.
Yeah.
Good. Holly next.
All right, thank you. That was really awesome, and it's really fun to hear this being discussed in the context of physics. I wanted to, I think it connects to the question that you just got also, because there is some stuff post-Longino that might be very helpful, where there is some pretty good research to the extent that if you have a genuinely diverse group of researchers, then they tend to produce more results or better results. So you can also kind of bring in this idea from like what Kabir was introducing of zetetic norms. So it could be a norm of inquiry that you need to have a certain kind of diversity of standpoints in order to do inquiry better rather than worse. But often I think that's not so much a diversity of training as a diversity of backgrounds that you bring to the training. So just there's more there. I have some, I think Fair and Placence are people who've worked on this, but there's more people.
Awesome.
Tushar.
Thanks very much. That was a terrific talk. I have a question about the sort of what the standpoint is adding to what's already there in unpristine. So the way that I understand this is a sort of I probably mangle this a little bit, but broadly speaking, you can think of with respect to standpoint epistemology, sort of a weaker and a stronger version, right? The weaker version is there are certain claims that are such that they are, in some sense, more epistemically accessible to people from group X. But once that kind of knowledge is accessed, it's not difficult to communicate it to other people, right? So I think my favorite example with Kabir is a bunch of us need visas to go to various places. It doesn't occur to a lot of people, but once you tell people that, everyone's broadly on board with what a terrible thing that is, right? But then there's a stronger sort of thing coming from the standpoint side of things, which is no, there are certain kinds of knowledge that are only accessible to people from group X, and in some sense sort of not communicable to people, sort of without residue to people outside group X.
Mm-hmm.
The unpristine, so to what extent is so I see the unpristine as already incorporating some of the weaker, the aspects from the weaker understanding of standpoint. And I want to, so the question is basically, what is your understanding of what's being added by the standpoint considerations to the unpristine considerations?
Good. Okay, thank you. So I do use the weaker version of standpoint. I prefer broad. But yeah, so I think agents can communicate their knowledge, but the important part here is how agents actually do the work of interpreting physical theories. So it's not adding to the unpristine data, it's how they are considering and what they are considering that's important. And that's going to change, that's agent dependent. Yeah.
Patrick.
Great. Thanks a lot for a really interesting talk. I'm wondering if there's another way of sort of locating this particular view in other terms of a kind of distinct kind of debate. So if we go back to like Quinean holism, and even further back to like C.I. Lewis has like the pragmatic conception of the a priori, there's a view that you can have where on the one hand you've got a collection of beliefs, and those beliefs are interdependent on one another, and changes to your web of beliefs can be localized to certain regions, and sometimes certain local changes to your beliefs require propagating changes to other beliefs. And it seems like one way that that project has developed in the kind of Lakatosh direction was to sort of say, well, communities have these like really robust, coherent norms for how they want to revise their beliefs in the face of new evidence or things like that. But you could also say that individual constituents of a community, even though they share the beliefs, they don't share the common underlying dependence relations on those beliefs. And so even though there's common beliefs to the community, there's like individual distinctions between how they think those beliefs are interconnected that play out in terms of disagreements about physical intuitions and things like that. And so like how you propagate the changes of your beliefs actually are different depending on how those webs are differently connected. And part of your standpoint is like which web connectivity you have. Does that sound like a plausible sort of place to fit this view in?
Yeah, I think there's. That's really interesting. Yeah, I think there is a place for it. We'll have to talk more and scope that out. Yeah, that's interesting. Thank you.
And that is just the end of our time. So let's thank our speakers.